Back then it meant a lot to me because, like I was very nervous, because I didn't want the on the production.
Oh, no, just do it for me as this as you go.
That's so silly.
All right, squeeze.
At 84, Mike Love finally breaks silence on Brian Wilson's death news that shook the music world on the morning of June 11, 2025. The world woke up to heartbreaking news. Brian Wilson, one of the most gifted and emotional voices in music history, had passed away. He wasn't just a musician. He was the creative heart behind the Beach Boys, the man who gave the world timeless songs filled with youth, longing, and beauty. News channels called it a great cultural loss. Fans across generations shared memories online. Artists around the world posted tributes. But the person whose reaction many were waiting for, Mike Love, Brian's cousin and longtime bandmate, remained completely silent. For more than a day, he said nothing. Not a post, not a quote, nothing. It wasn't the first time Mike had stayed silent through a major event, especially when it involved Brian. Their story had always been complicated. They built something beautiful together, but they also clashed, broke apart, and often blamed each other. And so, his silence felt heavy. It made people wonder, would Mike Love ever speak about Brian again? And if he did, what would he say? From cousins to creators of a sound back in 1961 in the city of Hawthorne, California, two cousins, Brian Wilson and Mike Love, joined hands to create what would become one of America's most famous bands. Along with Brian's brothers and a few close friends, they formed the Beach Boys. Their music brought the sound of sunshine, surfing, and California dreams into homes across the country. Mike had the showmanship and catchy lyrics. Brian had the melodies and the emotional depth. Together, they created hits like Surfing USA, I Get Around, and Fun, Fun, Fun. For a while, it seemed perfect, but even in those early days, cracks started to show. Brian was a deep thinker, often anxious and overwhelmed by pressure. Mike was more practical and focused on the group's commercial success. When Brian began to experiment with new sounds and ideas, Mike didn't always agree. Their differences became more obvious by the mid-1960s, especially during the creation of Pet Sounds, an album that would go on to be called one of the greatest of all time. While critics praised it, Mike believed it was too far from what the fans wanted. That disagreement would mark the beginning of years of personal and professional conflict, lawsuits, loss, and a band divided. As the Beach Boys continued, so did the tension. Brian's health got worse. He began to struggle with depression, anxiety, and emotional breakdowns. Meanwhile, Mike focused on keeping the band going, but their biggest fight came in the 1990s. When Mike sued Brian over 35 songs he claimed to have co-written, but was never credited for, songs that had become classics. Mike said the mistake wasn't Brian's fault, but rather Brian's father, Murray Wilson, who had removed his name from the credits. The court agreed with Mike, and Brian was ordered to pay him $13 million. While it was a legal win, it made fans furious. Many believed Mike was betraying the very person who had created the Beach Boys sound. After that, their relationship fell into cold silence. Then in 1998, Brian's brother and band peacemaker, Carl Wilson, died of cancer. It was a huge loss. Carl had always tried to hold the band together. Without him, the Beach Boys split into two sides. Mike Love had the rights to the band's name and continued touring. Brian began working solo, often without Jardine and David Marks, two original members. Fans were confused. The Beach Boys still existed, but they were no longer a united group. A short reunion and a longer silence. In 2012, something surprising happened. For the band's 50th anniversary, all the surviving members came back together for a reunion. Brian and Mike performed side by side again, and the band even released a new album. That's Why God Made the Radio. It felt like a healing moment. Maybe the past could be forgiven. But that hope didn't last long. After the tour ended, Mike announced he would continue with his own version of the Beach Boys without Brian, Al, or David. Once again, he faced criticism. Fans said he had fired Brian just after reuniting. Mike denied the claims, saying everything had been planned and agreed upon before the tour, but the damage was done. The fragile trust between Brian and Mike was broken once more. In the years that followed, they rarely spoke of each other. Then, in 2020, the divide became even deeper. Mike performed at a political fundraiser for Donald Trump. and Brian and Al quickly released a statement saying they had nothing to do with the event and didn't support it. Now, their differences were not just about music, they were personal, social, and deeply rooted. Brian became a symbol of damaged genius and emotional depth. Mike was often seen as the face of control, business, and cold decisions. A glimmer of hope, then silence forever. Just a year before Brian's death, there was a moment that gave fans a small glimmer of hope. In a rare BBC interview in 2024, Mike spoke gently about Brian. He said they had seen each other again. It wasn't as negative as people think, he said. He even hinted at working together again if the time was right. For a brief moment, people thought the feud might finally be over, but the reunion never happened. Brian's health was getting worse. He was under full legal protection due to memory loss and mental health issues. He rarely appeared in public. And then, on June 11, 2025, the story ended. Brian Wilson passed away quietly, far from the stage, the spotlight, or the music studio. It was a sad ending for a man who had once filled the world with such beautiful sound. And this time, everyone waited to see if Mike Love would remain silent again, or if, at 84, he would finally speak from the heart. Mike Love's emotional farewell to many people's surprise. Mike didn't wait long. On June 12th at 8 a.m., a post appeared on his official account. It was a black and white photo of him and Brian as children. The caption read, "Death leaves a heartache no one can heal. Love leaves a memory no one can steal." Shortly after, a 94-second video was shared by his team. In it, Mike Love sat quietly, wearing a black suit, holding a photo from Capitol Studios in 1965. His voice was soft, without the usual energy fans remembered. "We didn't always agree," he said, "but what we created together is undeniable. I didn't just lose a colleague, I lost a brother." It was simple, honest, and very different from how Mike had spoken in the past. For once, he didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He didn't bring up lawsuits, tours, or his place in the band's history. He just grieved. And in that moment, something changed. Critics who had once called him selfish now called his statement necessary. Others called it the most honest thing he's said in years. Even fans who had taken Brian's side for decades admitted that Mike had done the right thing. At least this time, the final goodbye still. Not everyone was convinced. Some longtime fans said it was too little, too late. Brian spent his last years alone. One comment read, "And now Mike speaks up when there's no one left to answer him." But others pushed back, saying it was better than staying silent forever. Mike's voice, his presence, and his quiet words showed that he cared even if he hadn't always shown it before. On June 14th, Mike Love attended Brian Wilson's private funeral in Los Angeles. He didn't perform. He didn't speak, but he was there, sitting quietly, a part of the final farewell, and maybe, in the end, that was enough. The story of Brian Wilson and Mike Love is not a perfect one. It's filled with beauty and heartbreak, genius and regret, but it's real. And when Mike finally broke his silence, what he gave the world wasn't a defense. It was a goodbye, a soft, broken, human goodbye. One that, just maybe, brought a little peace to a story that had been torn for too long. The last goodbye, the room was silent. No stage, no live music, just the soft sound of "Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder" echoing gently through the speakers. It was a quiet tribute, not a grand concert or flashy memorial. Former Beach Boys members like Al Jardine, David Marks, and Blondie Chaplin were present. But it wasn't a reunion. Brian Wilson had passed away in June 2025, and with his death, one of music's most emotional stories came to a close. What stood out most wasn't the absence of a performance. It was the presence of Mike Love. For decades, their relationship had been full of tension, disagreements, and silence. But at 84, Mike Love finally spoke, not with anger or blame, just a few short lines, simple and respectful. He didn't try to fix the past. He didn't rewrite the story, but he made it clear silence was no longer enough. After all the years of fighting, this moment wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about what was lost and what would never return. Brothers in music, divided by vision in the beginning, they were not just cousins, they were partners in sound. Mike Love and Brian Wilson were the foundation of the Beach Boys in the early 1960s. Together, they helped create what became known as the California sound, a mix of sunshine, surfing, cars, and youth. Brian was the musical genius, the one who worked tirelessly in the studio, experimenting with sounds and arrangements. Mike was the voice and lyricist, shaping the words that millions would sing along to. But as their fame grew, so did their differences. Brian wanted to push boundaries and create music that was deeper, more artistic. Mike wanted to stay true to what had made them famous: simple, catchy songs that fans loved. Their disagreements were not just creative, they were personal. The release of Pet Sounds in 1966 showed the world what Brian could do, but it also created distance within the band. Mike didn't oppose the album outright, but he feared it was too complex. This tension only grew as Brian began work on Smile, a bold and unusual project that he called a symphony to God. Mike thought it was too strange and risky. That project was never finished at the time, and Brian's mental health began to decline. Their bond, once strong, had started to break. Struggles behind the music as the 1970s and 1980s passed. Brian slowly pulled away from public life. He became more private, more withdrawn, and rarely performed. Meanwhile, Mike Love kept the Beach Boys going. He continued to tour and perform, keeping the brand alive. But the differences between art and business became clearer with each year. While Brian was praised as a genius, Mike was often seen as the one who cared more about money and fame. By the early 1990s, their conflict turned legal. Mike sued Brian over songwriting credits for 35 songs. He said Brian's father, Murray Wilson, had left his name off the credits years earlier. The lawsuit made headlines, and Mike won over $13 million. His name was added to many of the classic songs, but the public reaction was harsh. Many fans believed Mike was taking advantage of Brian's fragile mental health. The media portrayed him as greedy, someone who only cared about rights and royalties. Even though the legal issue had started decades ago, it became another reason for people to see Mike as the villain of the band's story. After Carl Wilson's death in 1998, the band broke apart. Mike took over the Beach Boys name and toured with new musicians. Brian performed under his own name. Al Jardine switched between them. To the fans, it felt like the Beach Boys had become two different groups, and the division felt permanent. Time softens the heart. In the years that followed, something began to change in Mike Love. In interviews during the 2020s, he no longer talked about lawsuits or creative control. Instead, he shared personal stories, memories from childhood, from family holidays, and from the early days of recording. He spoke of moments when Brian didn't want to leave the house, and Mike would encourage him to come to the show. These were small stories, but they said something bigger. Mike was no longer trying to win the argument. He was trying to understand what they had lost. He talked about how things could have been different if other people, managers, lawyers, even family members hadn't gotten in the way. He didn't try to paint himself as a victim or a hero. He simply said what was in his heart. Maybe it was age, maybe it was regret, but the man who had spent years defending his name was now more focused on remembering the good times. It was a quiet shift, but an important one. For the first time, Mike Love seemed to stop fighting the past and instead began to make peace with it. The weight of legacy. Brian Wilson's legacy had long been secure. He was praised around the world for his creativity. Pet Sounds was called one of the greatest albums of all time. Smile, although unfinished in the 1960s, was finally released decades later and celebrated as a masterpiece. Brian won awards, was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and had movies and documentaries made about his life. People spoke of him with awe, calling him a genius and a visionary. But Mike Love's legacy was more complicated. He had been the lead singer on many of the Beach Boys' biggest hits. He had written lyrics, helped define their sound, and kept the group alive for over 60 years. Still, in the eyes of many fans and the media, he was just the guy who wanted to hold the band back. Documentaries often painted him as the one who stopped Brian's creative dreams. His personal opinions and political views made him even more controversial. Despite all his work, he was rarely honored in the same way. He felt that his contributions were overlooked and that the story was being told without him. For someone who had given so much to the Beach Boys, it was a hard truth to accept. A quiet response to a loud world. When Brian died, the world reacted with deep sadness. Social media filled with tributes. News articles called him a genius, and celebrities shared memories. But Mike Love didn't step into the spotlight. He didn't give a long speech or make emotional statements. He released a short note, showed up quietly at the service, and let the music speak. Some people said he was being respectful. Others said he was trying to rewrite history, but the truth might be simpler. At 84, Mike Love was tired of fighting. He didn't want to change what people thought of him anymore. He knew his place in the story and he had accepted it. He wasn't the hero or the genius, but he was still here, the last one left, the last voice of a group that had changed music forever. And in his own way, he reminded people of that, not with big words, not with anger, just by showing up and letting the music play. The end of a long journey now. With Brian Wilson gone, Mike Love stands alone as the last founding member of the Beach Boys. It's a strange and lonely position for over 6 decades. The band was filled with both beauty and chaos, unforgettable harmonies, painful lawsuits, personal losses, and endless tours. Mike Love was always there, through the good and the bad, while Brian is remembered as the genius who created masterpieces. Mike is remembered as the man who kept the music on the road. One was praised for his art, the other was blamed for his ambition, but both were needed. Without Brian, there would be no Pet Sounds. Without Mike, there would be no Beach Boys concerts for generations of fans. Mike may never be seen the way Brian was, but that may no longer matter to him. He has lived through the full story from fame to fallout, from harmony to heartbreak. And now, at 84, with the final chapter written, Mike Love has broken his silence not to seek attention, but to honor what was lost, and to remind the world that he is still here, not as a shadow of the past, but as a witness to it.